the advice I gave about switching off the microphones when you finish speaking. It means the camera stays on you if you don't, rather than going to the person you're talking to. Secondly, when I introduced this session yesterday, I said that there was a written statement and drawing on file which had been submitted by a person who was going to participate but couldn't. I said that was Robin Worsman. It's actually Mary Bramwell, if you're looking that up. I gave you the wrong name. And the third point refers to conditions. I mentioned at the start of the inquiry on Tuesday that we'd had some additional comments on conditions in from Hofwig and the community councils, and that I'd be deciding what to do with those. I've confirmed that decision to the case officer now, so that email should come out to the conditions hearing participants today if it hasn't already come out. Is there anything else anybody wants to raise before we resume?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes. By lunchtime, there will be an updated conditions document as between Aberdeenshire and the applicant coming through with some further progress noted. So that will become, it'll be sent to all parties, obviously. The second point I think we may have covered is that, to be clear, that on Tuesday, when landscape finishes, because it won't finish today, that we do go straight on to the policy hearing session.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so as Mr Trinick says, we'll still be talking about landscape and visual impact when we resume here on Tuesday. And as he says, I'm going to run straight through. So hopefully by the end of Wednesday, across Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll finish landscape and visual, run into the policy hearing, and then run into the conditions hearing, depending on when each of those finishes. So I'll get a note sent out to the participants for all those sessions today, just to confirm that's how we're going to manage it. Mr Campbell.
Could I just ask you a follow-up question in relation to the amended schedule of conditions, which Mr Trinick's just announced is somewhere in the ether, probably. Given that you've made a ruling on Hofwig's submissions, which were tendered last week, but I haven't seen the ruling yet, and you haven't confided in me what it is, so I don't really know what to expect. Would it be helpful to suggest that Mr Trinick's team wait until we see that ruling so that we can have input, or do you expect me to have input into the amended conditions schedule which is coming forward?
I don't think they're interdependent, so you'll get the response to your conditions this morning. So if you disagree, you can let me know. I mean, if you disagree that Mr Trinick doesn't need to wait, but in summary, I've accepted some of those comments and not accepted others, and I've given reasons. I've asked the case office to say in the email that I'm not expecting other submissions unless there are submissions that show further progress towards agreement, which I think Mr Trinick's submission probably comes in line with, although I know that only means agreement between the applicant and the council.
Corollary of that, with respect, is that if there isn't agreement, and in fact there is disagreement, there's only two places you can put it, either into the draft in a schedule or in a closing submission. Because ultimately you'll have to, if there is disagreement on what you've ruled today, with respect, of course, then you need to know about that.
Yeah, and
you're not ruling me out of disagreeing further, I don't think.
No, I'm saying I'm not expecting further submissions. If I receive them, I'll look and see what I need to do with them.
That's a blend of subtlety which is beyond me, but no doubt we'll see what happens. The point has a serious tone to it, which is this, that when all this is said and done, if there's a consent, it's the local authority that has to implement these conditions, and it's the people who live here, who I have the honour to represent, who are on the sharp end of enforcement. And if they need enforcement, it's their local authority they have to go to. It's they who have to do the reporting. So accuracy is paramount, and comprehensiveness is also paramount, in our opinion.
Yeah, and if there's a condition that's been agreed so far between the applicant and the council, that doesn't mean we won't discuss it in the conditions hearing, because there are various other people taking part that have raised comments or questions about lots of conditions. And I've got some questions of my own about some of the conditions, including some of the agreed ones. So there'll still be a full discussion. So when we finished yesterday, we were midpoint through Mr. Campbell's cross-examination of the applicant's witness, Mr. Ferber, so we'll continue with that now. Over to you, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. Good morning. If I could take you back to paragraph 319 of your inquiry report, which is at page 17. We began to discuss this yesterday. You describe views of the development there as being frequently restricted. That can, of course, be the case, but have you taken into account the very large number of small back roads there are, which provide sometimes restricted and sometimes comprehensive views of the development? What I would like to suggest to you is that in the language you've used here, you're underplaying the impact of the development on these many small back roads which characterise this area.
We've selected a number of viewpoints from the minor back roads in consultation with the council and community councils as part of the EIA scoping exercise. So I think we have a good representative selection of those, and it's usual practice to focus the assessment on the main routes, so the A roads and the B roads, but also to undertake that sort of assessment from unclassified roads. I do mention at paragraph 3.31 of my inquiry report that there would be the potential for significant effects from unclassified roads in the landscape within approximately 7 kilometres of the proposed turbines, where views towards the proposals wouldn't be restricted by hedgerows and tree planting. And then I give some examples of those viewpoints. That's not a comprehensive list, but it's acknowledging the fact that there would be significant effects from those routes.
Well, that's perfectly fair for you to refer to that. Thank you. You won't, I suppose, be surprised to hear from layman's evidence that there is a perception that the impact on these minor roads has been underplayed. What can we say about cycling in the same vein? We touched on this yesterday, I think. Do you take account of the sensitivity of recreational cyclists using the countryside just for that purpose, recreation rather than commuting?
Yes, I think. So yeah, I think we touched on this yesterday, and I did sort of highlight it, paragraph 3.32, and I appreciate that Hoffwick is not party to the statement of agreed matters, but the point is that the Aberdeenshire cycle route is specifically mentioned, and the core path network. I appreciate that the format of the inquiry report sort of necessarily summarises what the significant effects are and identifies the main areas. You know, further detail is obviously outlined within the LVIA chapter that was submitted. So I appreciate it might look like it's underplayed because it's confined to a single paragraph, but it's just the nature of trying to keep the inquiry report as concise as possible.
Obviously, that you wouldn't expect, you wouldn't be asked or undertake a cycling survey, and I wouldn't, of course, expect that of you. But once again, what I'm trying to reflect in these questions is public perception that the conciseness of your inquiry report doesn't really reflect the very large numbers of cyclists who are known to use these roads, particularly in holidays and weekends.
Yeah, I think with due respect, I appreciate your position, but we need to focus on the routes that are sort of identified and promoted. That's not to say that the minor roads aren't used by cyclists. We sort of encapsulate those within the sort of road users description. It might not be explicit within the inquiry report, but we're certainly not ruling out the fact that anybody on different modes of transport might use the minor road system, but necessarily we need to focus on where most of the experience would occur, and that's usually from the promoted routes. If I could just add in relation to the core path network, obviously people are able to walk, you know, beyond the core path network. We don't necessarily document all of that, but we obviously have locations on some of the hilltops that are not necessarily connected by core paths. So we obviously talked about Sculty Hill yesterday. That is part of a part of a core path route, but there's other hills that are not necessarily at the end of promoted routes. So what we're trying to do is capture the more important sort of locations within the representative viewpoint assessment.
I suppose I could legitimately say that the important lies in the eye of the beholder, doesn't it, to some extent?
I think so, but I just go back to the role of the landscape and visual assessment, and I think there's been recent guidance within the clarifications to Glivia document. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, but the main emphasis on that is to try and draw attention to the more important. That's not to say that these effects don't have some importance to local people, but it's trying to focus on the main effects that could influence the decision-making process. So it's not about cataloguing every single location where you might see the proposal. It's trying to focus on a representative selection in order to inform the decision-maker.
But to help the reporter, she should be aware, shouldn't she, that there is this adjunct of roads, these additional roads and tracks which are... Yeah, definitely, and I think we have covered that, you know, with specific reference to the unclassified roads and the series of representative viewpoints from them. Very good. Let's move to 322, if we may, please. I wonder if you could help me with a little clarity on that. You've listed a number of viewpoints in the first sentence. Those are called significant visual effects. And in addition, here's a reference to viewpoint 9, described as a significant adverse effect. So are you able to classify, first of all, the list in the first sentence? Are those all significant adverse effects?
Yes, they are.
They are. It doesn't say that, does it?
Well, it's significant visual effects. I think the starting point is that all effects are adverse with wind turbines. That's the position that's taken with the methodology. But yeah, for the sake of a missing word, I accept that you could add adverse between significant and visual in the first sentence.
I'm obliged, thank you. There are 22 viewpoints. 16 of them are found to have suffered significant adverse effects. That's 73%, if my maths is right. Is that unusually high for a development of this kind, in your experience?
No, not particularly. I think the way that viewpoints are selected, and you'll be aware that when we proposed viewpoints as part of the scoping report, we had, I believe, I wasn't specifically involved in the process because it's before my time, but I think there were 15 viewpoints. We then had an additional 7 photomontages and another 6 wire lines that were sort of undertaken. There was, you know, there is a sort of process where you tend to select viewpoints where there are likely to be significant effects. There's always going to be veering towards the identification of more significant effects on viewpoints than less, just by the nature of the purpose of providing them. I think that sometimes you undertake visualizations and assessments from locations that are more distant, perhaps because at those locations the receptor is particularly sensitive or important. So therefore that you do need to sort of spread beyond the kind of the 10-kilometre boundary just to check that. And I think some of those viewpoints were captured as a result of the consultation feedback. I think, if I'm correct, there were some viewpoints to the north with Benaki that were specifically chosen at the request of the council. And we didn't think that there was any potential for significant effects there, but we included them. So I think, in short, the answer to your question is that we would expect the majority of viewpoints to result in significant effects from viewpoints that we're proposing, because we're trying to capture where those significant effects are and illustrate that. There's no point in showing, presenting a viewpoint in a location where there's clearly not going to be a significant effect. It's not informing the decision making.
So, in summary, if I get your answer correctly, you don't think that 75%, 73% is unusually high?
No, I don't, and we don't tend to go on percentages in terms of viewpoint significant effects. We tend to look at two things. First of all, the fact that viewpoints are representative of receptors, so it's also establishing
I'm sorry, can I
yeah.
ask you to pause?
Yeah.
This is not a question which is critical about the number of, which is critical of the number of viewpoints or viewpoint selection. That's not where I'm going. I'm simply looking at the proportion of viewpoints which yield significant adverse effects, which I think you will hear evidence that that is perceived to be very high. And it's really a comment on that I'm after.
Okay, well, that's quite a simple answer. I think it's not something that we pay much attention to, because we would expect the majority of viewpoints to have significant effects. We don't say because it reaches, I don't know, 75, 80%, therefore that's an issue that has a bearing in the decision making in particular, because we're always going to be suggesting locations where there are going to be significant effects.
Go next, please, to 329, which talks about Bankery. And you say effects would only be experienced where views are available predominantly in the northern part of the settlement, and views from the majority of the settlement would be restricted by surrounding buildings and intervening tree cover. Fair enough, but are you aware that the settlement of Bankery is growing and moving north, and that there are on the north side of the town two pretty substantial housing developments which it's anticipated will have views?
I've certainly seen the fact there's construction and there's recent development on the edge of Bankery, and I think that's to the south of viewpoint 19 from the cowshed. Yeah. And what I would say is that there are going to be that there would be significant effects from the road corridor and the footways within that area, because I think, although viewpoint 19 is a particularly open view, as you go further south into the settlement, you will get significant effects. So that's certainly true. What I think is when you move away from the road corridor, and the reporter may have seen this already if she's visited Bankery, is that the settlements or the new development is actually enclosed by woodland planting, and that's a mixture of coniferous and broadleaf woodland. So it's not something that we would anticipate would, we're not going to be clear felling all of that woodland that would open up views. So in summary, in answer to your question, yes, there would be some significant effects on the settlement, which we've acknowledged, but we don't anticipate there to be any additional sort of significant effects because of the screening effect of the woodland along the northern edge of the settlement.
Thank you. I think that helps me with which they will be eventually, have you taken into account, or do you think you've taken into account, the outlook from these new housing developments and any others that in that part of Banco which seems to be zoned for housing?
I think, as I said, there's a mixture of sort of commercial forestry, but also there's a fair amount of mixed woodland. So we don't anticipate that's necessarily forestry for felling. Often you get on the edge of settlements sort of woodland that's more amenity related rather than forestry. Notwithstanding that, if any areas of woodland were to be felled that were, first of all, it would be very surprising that the full extent of that wouldn't be clear felled in one go. There would be sort of coop felling, and wouldn't anticipate those views being opened up. However, any views that were to be opened up, because of the topography of Banchory at that northern edge, what we'd anticipate is that any views would be limited to the northern edge of those housing estates. You'll be aware of other settlements that I've mentioned in my evidence in chief yesterday, where there are views and significant effects from the edge of settlements, but when you move within the settlements, those views get reduced substantially to the extent that you only get intermittent views of the wind farm, or it is completely screened.
Could I move on to Chapter 4 of your report? Trying not to take too long this morning, and sorry if I seem to be jumping around a bit, but on page 31, paragraph 4.4 and following, this is the perennial and much discussed subject of localization and what it means, and localized effects. I'm really looking for a little bit of clarity, Mr. Ferber, in relation to your paragraph 4.5. The first sentence is uncontroversial. The second sentence, you say, while it's accepted that every proposal is assessed on its own merits, reporters have taken a view. Now, what do you intend the reporter here to take from that sentence? Is she on her own and free to take her own, to exercise her own judgment?
Yeah, I think it's just making reference to the fact that reporters in the plural have, taken a view on what typically comprises the geographical extent of localised significant effects, and that's why I referenced Mr. Bell's cases. It's not suggesting that the reporter here can't, will obviously take make her own judgment.
What's your advice to her then?
I would say that she needs to. It's not for me to give the reporter advice. It's just to point out that there are cases where other cases where the geographical extent of localised effects have been defined. That's all that I'm pointing out.
You see, if you talk to lawyers about other cases, they think precedent. You talk to landscape architects, they don't think precedent, they think possibly similarity. Now, with respect, you are here to help the reporter, whether you like it or not. And so I'd like to know what advice you're giving about what judgment she should make in relation to the question of whether the effects of this wind farm are localised or not. Because I can't see in 4.5 a clear conclusion. You seem to be... Let me finish just a second. You seem at one point to be delegating responsibility to David Bell, the planning witness who's yet to come. And then later in the paragraph you say, what are the sort of things she should take into account? And then finally, you dodge the question in the last sentence by saying you conclude the effects would not be any greater than expected, which, with respect, Mr. Ferber, is entirely self-fulfilling and, frankly, not terribly helpful to the reader.
No, I mean, I think it comes back to the point that you said, that the role, or implied that the role of the landscape architect isn't to advise on, planning judgments or planning balance, which is why at the first opportunity I defer to to Mr. Bell's judgment on that in relation to other cases. I'm not pretending to have a encyclopedic knowledge of other Scottish wind farm cases. You'd be aware this is my first inquiry in Scotland, so
And you're very welcome. And you're very welcome here. But just to interrupt you, and I'm not being facetious. You know, you have professional expertise. You bring it to the inquiry from other places. It's very welcome. I think if I were the reporter, I would be looking to you for, if not guidance, at least advice as to what you think is meant by localised. And with respect to you, I can't find it in this paragraph.
Well, I defer to Mr. Bell's judgment, which suggests it applies to an area extending up to approximately 12 kilometres. That is a planning judgment that's been made elsewhere. Yeah.
Well, if that's your answer, we'll note it. Thank you, and deal with it in submissions. Thank you very much. I'd like to, just 1 second. Yeah. In chapter 6 of your inquiry report, which you head matters raised by third parties, you summarised my clients' matters that concern them in 6.2, and then between 6.3 and 6.12, you simply state a contrary view in every case, a view either drawn from earlier in your report or from the EIA. There's no reasoning in here, is there? It's simply repeating views that we can find elsewhere. Sorry, the word view is the wrong one here because of its double meaning. Opinions. In these paragraphs, 6.3 onwards, by way of contradiction or opposition to what Hofwig are saying, you are simply stating an opposite point of view. But I don't see any reasoning at all in this section.
Well, there is reasoning under each viewpoint. I appreciate it's fairly brief. It's not a full impact assessment, but it's proportionate to the potential effects that are there. So in each of the cases, I visited the viewpoints with the additional wire lines that have now been submitted to the inquiry, and I made a judgment in the field on the various aspects that I record under each of those paragraphs. So, for example, at viewpoint 1, I don't think that the turbines would be discernible. Whilst the turbines would be discernible in clear weather, at beyond 20 kilometres, I just don't think that there would be significant visual effects. So there's not a requirement to go into a huge amount of analysis there. It's just stating what my judgment is based on visiting those viewpoints with the visualisation material, and that approach is repeated for each of the viewpoints.
So what the report has got in front of it then is two sets of judgments. Sorry. Two sets of judgments, those of Hofwig or its witnesses, and yours simply expressed in an opposing sentence.
I don't think that Ms Platt has covered the viewpoints, all of those viewpoints in detail, or certainly in much more detail than I have. I don't recall, and I'm happy to be corrected, whether Cairn Mount has been assessed by Ms Platt. Certainly Scolty Hill has been at some detail, but that was also covered in our LVIA originally. I think the other effects I've cross-referenced to the paragraphs within the LVIA where we have assessed it without wanting to create a lot of repetition. So if you look at under viewpoint 3 and 4 and also 5, I do make cross-reference to the LVIA where those judgments are made, and just summarise what I consider the magnitude and effects would be.
Okay. Now, the EIA judgments were not your judgments. They were somebody else's. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, they were. But as we said in my cross-examination with the council's barrister, I've adopted those judgments. I've looked at them and I've agreed with them.
I just want to be clear whose judgments we're talking about. That's all. You adopt the same approach to the Community Council's objections from 613 to 618. Just one question about this section. In 618, the Community Council at Echton Skeen express what you might call an adverse opinion in quite trenchant terms. You say, I acknowledge the issues raised, including the effects on Sculty Hill users, and your assessment of effects are covered at section 3. That's all you have to say about section.
Well, it's tried to keep it as concise as possible. It's, we could be copying and pasting huge amounts of assessment either from the LVIA or from my inquiry report under each item. It's trying to acknowledge that the issues have been addressed elsewhere in the evidence. I mean, just to reiterate on that front, obviously the language I use is different to the Community Council, and that's to be expected. I mean, I've referred to it as significant adverse from Sculty Hill. They've used slightly different language, and that's their prerogative. But I tend to defer to the professional language rather than some of the comments which they're entitled to express.
Staying in chapter 6, can I ask you a few questions, please, about residential impact? In your report, you focused, as one would expect, perhaps on settlements large and small and impacts on settlements large and small. I'm not able to see that you've assessed in any systematic way impacts on dispersed housing, farmhouses and individual dwellings across the study area, particularly between 2 and 3 kilometres. How are they represented in your findings?
We do acknowledge that there would be the potential for significant visual effects from high sensitivity receptors, and I'm reading here from paragraph 6.21, such as private views of residents within 10 kilometres of the turbines, where those views are less restricted by landform, other dwellings and planting. The purpose of the residential visual amenity assessment is not to identify individual significant effects, it's to identify properties where residents have the potential to experience such a significant effect that the impact could be considered to be not in the public interest. So that includes aspects such as whether the effect could be legitimately considered to be overbearing or the turbines would encircle the property. So as a result of that, as a result of the purpose of the RVAA, we focus on a study area within 2 kilometres. That distance is taken from best practice guidance by the Landscape Institute, which is which recommends a offset of between 1.5 and 2 kilometres. We acknowledge that in some other wind farm assessments, it's the survey area is extended slightly beyond 2 kilometres. But from my knowledge of those cases, there's been no overbearing effects found on any property, or no unacceptable effects, which may include overbearing aspects, has not been found on any property beyond 2 kilometres. Therefore, in terms of the RVAA, the study area and the focus on properties within 2 kilometres is what we focused on. Coming back to your original question about essentially, well, what about the properties between 2 kilometres and 10 kilometres? This comes back to the proportionality of landscape and visual impact assessment, and whether or not the impact, whether significant or not, on private views of properties between 2 and 10 kilometres is going to be something that's taken into account within the planning balance.
Because there are degrees of severity of adverse impact, and they may stop short of failing the test today, I'm sorry. There are degrees of severity of adverse impact, and they may stop short of rendering the house, as the language has it, an unpleasant place in which to live, but nevertheless be severe. So what I'm interested in is the houses or individual settlements which fit into that bracket. They're not too far away for you to be able to ignore them. They're not in settlements, and therefore can't be aggregated with others, but they're not so close that you immediately say, well, that looks as if it might be subject to an overbearing impact.
Yeah, I appreciate your question, and I think the answer to that is that the approach that we've adopted is consistent with other LVIAs for wind farms, not just in Scotland, but in other countries of the UK as well. And with respect to Ms. Platt, she and others, there isn't any sort of consistent survey of properties between 2 kilometres and 10 kilometres cataloguing those effects. It is acknowledged that there would be the potential for those significant effects where clear views are available. But when we typically, when we're preparing an LVIA, we don't visit several hundred properties and
understand that.
Those effects.
I understand you're following the rules.
Yeah.
I get that completely. And I also understand that you're following the GLVIA where you have to. But nevertheless, you would recognise from me, wouldn't you, that there is in this case a significant number of properties which might be subject to those adverse effects, which are not perhaps subjected to overbearing effects, but can't be ignored and can't be aggregated into settlements. So that's a factor the reporter must take into account, is it not?
I think that's all covered at 6.21 of my inquiry report. There's acknowledgement that there is that potential. Whether it could be legitimately described as significant or not, we don't have the evidence base for either party to say otherwise. I think the same could apply to the settlement assessments that we've done for Bankery. What we're trying to do is we're not going to go to Bankery and assess every single property within Bankery and whether it's got an effect or not. What we're trying to do is to say which parts of the settlement are likely to have significant effects. So we're following the approach that's adopted, as you've indicated.
It's called a threshold, isn't it, when a house is deemed to be subjected to overbearing significant effects?
It is, and I think that, as I said earlier, the 2 kilometres not just in this case, but has been found generally to be adequate to capture all the potential for overbearing effects.
I think I'm taking from your answers, this is a bit of a rough and ready measure, isn't it?
I think it's quite a generous measure, because certainly for the schemes that I've been working on, admittedly they're in Wales, but the issues there were that there were properties that were less than a kilometre from turbines of a similar size, and it was agreed that those wouldn't be overbearing. So I think doubling that distance to 2 kilometres gives an acceptable safety margin in terms of not missing properties where the effects might be considered unacceptable.
Do you know property Craig Shannock, 17.4?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that the effects on that property might be perceived to be overbearing?
No, I don't. I think they would be significant, but not overbearing.
Do you know property Burnhead, number 13?
Yes.
And can I ask you the same question about that?
Yeah, again, significant but not overbearing.
Right. So what is it, in your professional view, that tips the balance here? Is it simply proximity or something else?
No, so it's a combination of factors for each of those properties. It's not simply a distance measure. I think in the case of, all of this is documented in terms of the updated RVAA. So there's a description for each of the properties you mentioned and others, where we've looked at the effects from the property itself, from the garden and from the access track, identified what those effects are, and then made a judgment on, first of all, whether they're significant or not, and secondly, whether they would meet the residential visual amenity threshold. So it's
which is a matter of professional judgment, is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, there isn't a sort of a recipe that you follow, but with the way that we structure it, it's intended that the results of the judgment can be seen to be transparent.
Yes, I just want to understand how you get to the conclusion. And the professional judgment, I think you're telling us, is the landscape architect's judgment doesn't take into account any other possible significant effects, such as, for example, noise.
No, I think it's very clear that the residential visual amenity assessment is just that, and yeah.
I'm obliged, Mr. Ferber. Thank you. I have no more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Rogerson, would you like to ask any questions of Mr. Ferber? Okay, no questions. And Mr. Wells, have you got any?
No, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, I've got a few questions. So, the first one, there's a couple of things that came up in cross-examination with Mr. Findlay yesterday about the idea of trying to compare the scale or the height of turbines with the scale or height of landforms. Quite a lot of the representations from individuals in this application talk about how they perceive the proposed wind turbines would look in terms of scale when they compare it to Hill of Fare, whether using the visuals or some of them refer to visualizations and some of them just make the point. I think that when you were being cross-examined by Mr. Findlay, you stated that some people don't understand what the S&H guidance means and that you had some concerns about how it's interpreted by a lot of practitioners. Now, I know you were talking about document 1010, but I just wondered if you could tell me particularly what part of that document is the guidance you're worried is misinterpreted. You can have a look.
Sorry, I'll just bring that up for
Yeah.
you.
I should have said the number at the start.
It's fine, I should know what it is, where it is. So the first section is on page 41. And it talks about landform.
41.
Yes. So it talks about the ability to use landform to restrict visibility of turbines, and we talked in the evidence about setting them back from the edge. So that's one aspect. The second one is in relation to landscape character. So on page, PDF page 17, it talks about, is the landform simple or complex and diverse? And will the proposal confuse or undermine those qualities? So my point was that the landform is quite simple. It goes back to my point in evidence about the key characteristics normally being considered suitable in relation to landform. But the point about undermining these qualities, I think that's a relevant point that SNH make, and I think what some practitioners have done is to take that one step further and suggest that the addition of turbines can shrink a landform, which is the part that I've got issue with. So I don't have issue with what SNH are saying in that regard.
Okay.
I think that probably covers the main point. I think it was important to say that in response to Mr. Finley's questions that SNH don't suggest that adding turbines on a landform would give the perception of shrinking the landform. I think I slightly confused matters there, but that's the approach that some practitioners have taken.
So is it specifically shrink that gives you concern? It's like dominate. Some people say dominate, and some people say diminish. Do you have the same concerns about that?
Yeah, it's the issue of the baseline of the landform changing because of the turbines. I accept that the addition of turbines is adverse and that it can have an impact on perception of landscape character, but I don't think that it can shrink something that's already there and it's solid. It's a very different form to a turbine.
Thank you. glad I asked, because there's a section on, there's some, give me a second. That's fine, it's those sections, then that's what I'll take as your answer. Okay, the next question I was going to ask was in your paragraph 216 of your inquiry report, where you say, you talk about moving turbines back away from the steeper slopes as much as practically possible. And my question is, does the EIAR somewhere show me how much that was practically possible in this case?
I think if you, it probably doesn't say, demonstrate that explicitly, but I think one of the considerations that could be looked at, if I just bring up chapter 3 of the EIR quickly. So this is 001.009. And I think that what you can see on there is the turbine locations, but what would have been available is the what we call the ellipses or the buffers to that would enable the relationship between the turbines to be designed so that you have so that you don't have a lot of overlap. Because obviously, if you've got disturbed air that would disrupt the wind coming to the next turbine, that kind of dictates the spacing. That isn't shown on these diagrams, but that's what would have been informing the layout.
Is that the diagrams that go through the iteration of that?
It is, yeah, the layout. There's table 3.1 for your reference.
Okay, thank you. Your microphone. That's right. I've got a question about microsighting. So, chapter 3 of the EIAR states, I haven't got the reference, but it states, oh, I have, it happens to be in front of me, that it's proposed that 100-metre microsighting allowance around the turbine locations and all other infrastructures allowed. The technical assessments presented in chapters 6 to 14 have considered the potential for microsighting. Do you know if there's anything specific in the EIAR, particularly the chapter on landscape and visual impacts, that shows that assessment or the outcome of that assessment?
I'm not aware of anything specific, Ma'am. I would just say, apart from the fact that it's been, the potential for that has been considered.
Thank you. So I'm going on to your 3.53, which is about aviation lighting. You mention aircraft detection lighting system here. So my understanding is there is a reduced lighting scheme proposed, and that the assessment which finds some significant adverse effects by night is based on the reduced lighting scheme and the lighting direction abilities that you've mentioned.
Yeah, that's correct.
Has aircraft detection lighting system also been assessed in terms of what further change that might result in terms of the visual impacts?
No, we've assessed it based on the reduced number of lights in terms of the turbines, number of turbines, and the fact that there would be the ability to reduce the intensity of lighting if the conditions were so suitable in terms of visibility within 5 kilometres. But in terms of the I suppose your question is, has the frequency of where the lighting when the lighting would be operated, has that been taken into account? No, the answer is no. We've assessed the worst case.
Yeah, and really I was asking partly because and we've still to come on and discuss conditions, but one of the proposed conditions has a sort of element in it relating to aircraft detection lighting system, but it's more as something to be taken, you might not know about this, to be fair, something to be taken account of at times when the lighting scheme's reviewed rather than the proposal. So the question is just in terms of what's actually proposed, where things are left on lighting, there would be a reduced lighting scheme, there would be some nighttime visual effects, but that's what
which is significant, and we've already assessed that, and then this is in addition, that would reduce it further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Campbell's covered all my questions on RVAA, so I don't need to ask those. So that's the end of the questions. I suggest we have a short break, and then Mr. Trinick can re-examine.
I have one question, ma'am, so I might as well ask it.
Oh, okay.
Yesterday, Mr. Ferber, you were taken by Mr. Finlay to the landscape sensitivity study, in particular CD86. I'd like you to go to it, please. And I'm not going to try and get out the electronic page myself, but if you go to electronic page 84, I better get it out actually. I have to wait for me to find it, I'm afraid now. Sorry about this, man. I'm going to find the place. Yeah, we're talking here about wooded estates, landscape character type 17. Mr. Finlay took you there. And he took you to sensitivity to development. When the landscape sensitivity study talks under this heading of wooded estates to sensitivity to development, where does it envisage that development taking place?
Within the wooded estates.
Thank you. That's my only question.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a break until 11:15 and we'll come back and Mr. Finlay will introduce his witness.
Institute. Having obtained your professional qualification some time ago, you've worked extensively in Scotland and indeed in Aberdeenshire, looking at, amongst other things, wind farms. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to going to take your recognition as read. I want to start by just picking up on a number of couple of points that Mr. Ferber made in answer to the reporter's questions a few moments ago. So we need to have CD 10.10 to hand. That's 010010, siting and design. And, and the overall topic, as I recall, was the contrast between the scale and height of the turbines and the scale and height of the landform. And Mr. Ferber first took us to page 41 of Siting and Design, which I think is electronic page 42. He went to the heading landform. Before I ask you to comment on that, in what section of Siting and Design does this extract fall?
It comes in Annex 1, which is siting and design considerations for turbines 15 to 50 metres in height. So it's very specific guidance for those smaller turbines.
I think that's at electronic page 38. So just bearing that in mind, if we then move on to electronic page 42, under landform, two questions. The first relates to the first sentence, smaller turbines, and we, given your answer, we just know what that is referring to, have more potential to use landform to restrict their visual impact than larger commercial models. Now, we know this guidance was considering, in terms of larger commercial models, turbines up to 140 metres. We're now, at this inquiry, considering turbines up to 200 metres. To what extent do you think the landform has the potential to restrict visual impact for turbines of that size in this location?
In terms of the larger turbines, upwards to 250 metres or so, currently proposed in a number of schemes. I would say that landform and variations in landform has limited scope to provide full screening of wind turbines of that size. But what it can do, and particularly where you've got more extensive upland areas, where I have seen and reviewed larger scale wind turbine developments, they are better assimilated and their apparent scale reduced where there's some intermediate screening, low-level screening of turbine bases, because it makes them appear less dominant in relation to an upland landform. They are inevitably located in uplands, particularly in Scotland. But this involves, of course, having an expansive upland area where you do have scope to utilise landform, particularly a sort of varied rolling landform that can provide such screening.
And applying those thoughts to this particular site and these particular turbines, to what extent do you think the landform here restricts the visual impact, or is capable of doing so?
I think it's really difficult. It's an isolated hill. It is a narrow ridge in my view. That severely limits scope to set the turbines well into the core of the upland area in order to utilise any variation in landform in the surrounding intermediate landscape surrounding the site, which can hide the bases to some extent. I'm not talking about hiding a complete turbine. I think that's impossible. I think we all know that you know, with the size of turbines that have been proposed, it's difficult to completely screen, but there are ways with careful siting and careful site selection where that can be achieved so that effects on scale are minimised, and leading on from that, landscape and visual effects.
Thank you. Moving on to the second point, which is the extent and then Nature Scott's guidance, or insofar as it's relevant to the concept of turbines diminishing a landform or landscape. Stepping back for a moment, I think yesterday Mr. Ferber suggested, well, Nature Scott's guidance is some age. In terms of the application of principles by that, in that guidance, are you concerned about applying it, given that it was produced in 2019 or 2017? I can't remember which, but certainly over 5 years ago. Are you aware of, well, take it in stages. Do you have any concern about applying its principles?
I don't. It was produced in 2017. Turbines have got larger since then, certainly the ones that are currently proposed. The guidance, particularly, I think it states somewhere in the guidance, I can't remember the precise paragraph number, but I can find that, that it's principally looking at turbine heights of up to 140 metres to tip. I think the document it provides sound siting and design principles. A lot of those principles are applied to other forms of development, or can be applied to other forms of development. They're derived from similar sources. I would mention transmission lines, particularly the Holford rules, which are part of the design for routine transmission lines. It's about relationships to landform. It's about reducing visual impact. It's all these aspects that need to be considered in siting and designing a large structure, and in this specific case, a wind farm in the landscape. I think the guidance has stood up well. It's used in England, and Scottish Natural Heritage were the first to provide such guidance. And in my experience, it is well used by professionals.
Thank you. Are you aware of it being criticised by reporters or indeed Scottish ministers?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Thank you. Coming to the specific, I think Mr. Ferber took us to, my note said page 17, but it may have been page 18, dealing with, which would be electronic page 19 of the document. That's CD 1010. And I must admit, and it may be my poor recording, wasn't quite sure whether he was agreeing with what Nature Scott have said or not. But in terms of just so the report is clear as to your view, as to whether Nature Scott considers that turbines can diminish a landform, can I ask you to go, I'm just going to take you to 3 paragraphs and then ask you a question. First of all, 325. And if you look in the 3rd sentence, you'll see it's also important that the scale and extent of a wind farm do not seem to overwhelm the distinctive character and scale of a landform. And then 329, in the last sentence, narrow bands, the sentence we looked at yesterday, narrow bands of uplands, etc., should be avoided if a wind farm on the hills would dominate the landscape on both sides. And then 331, landscape scale and openness are particularly important characteristics in relation to wind turbines, because large wind turbines can easily seem to dominate some landscapes. What's your view as to whether turbines can diminish or dominate a landscape or landform? What's your understanding of my apologies, let me ask that again. What's your understanding of Nature Scott's view, and how far does that coincide with your view?
Well, it's evident from the document that that Nature Scott do consider that larger turbines can dominate some landforms, particularly prominent landforms, which I think is key to this inquiry. I agree with that view. I have had a very long experience in looking at different wind farms in different contexts and in undertaking landscape sensitivity assessments, studies for wind farm development. Of course, I agree that larger wind turbines can dominate landforms. It's a simple design principle. It's quite evident when you look at the visualizations that have been produced as part of the LVIA, that is the case in certain viewpoints.
Thank you. If we can move away from that line of questioning, and can you take up your report, which is CD 14.3, and I want to ask you about paragraph 5.2, which is on page 9.
Sorry, Mr. Finney, can you just repeat the paragraph number, please?
5.2. In that paragraph, you give figures for relative low relief of Hill of Fare Ridge towards the end of that paragraph. And you will recall yesterday that Mr. Furbear gave some dimensions of the ridge. First of all, can you explain to the reporter what you were trying to illustrate by reference to those figures? And secondly, can you give us your view on the narrowness or otherwise, and indeed the width of the ridge as you describe it, or plateau as it's also described in the EAR?
By relief, I mean the height which is appreciated, the height of the Hill of Fare appreciated from the surrounding lower lying ground, rather than the AOD height of the hills above sea level. I've judged relief by analysis of the levels in the surrounding area within around 1 to 2 kilometres of the foot of the Hill of Fare. And as I've stated in paragraph 5.2 of my inquiry report, the relief is generally less when seen from the north, when compared with seen from the south, and that's stated there. So they're general sort of figures which allow a comparison of the relative height of the turbines against that relief. I think it's also interesting to note that the steep slopes of the hill group of the Hill of Fare and the juxtaposition of the hill group with the lower lying surrounding farmland and valleys give an impression of greater height than indicated by the relief. In terms of the width of the Hill of Fare, Mr. Ferber disagreed with my dimension that I had stated in my inquiry report. I had said it was around 7 kilometres. I had taken that at the widest point of the hill group, between the B977 and A980 road to the south, and the B9119 road to the north. It does depend where your measurements are taken from, where you assume the foot of the hill is, if you're doing that width measurement. But I've taken those roads because the landscape character type boundaries largely accord with those roads, the landscape character type of the outlying hills and ridges. And also it's logical given that the roads are commonly aligned at the break and slope at the foot of steeper slopes, and that's the case here. I think another interesting thing to note, though, is that it's 7 kilometres between those roads encircling the hill, but the width of the upland plateau top of the Hill of Fare, which excludes the steep side slopes, which are often wooded, is considerably narrower, and that, in my estimation, is around 3 to 4 kilometres.
One follow-up question from that. I think until Mr. Ferber gave evidence yesterday, the position that the council understood was that set out in the EIAR in those passages that I took Mr. Ferber to yesterday, which talked about either a narrow ridge or a narrow plateau. Just so the reporter is clear, are you content with the descriptions in the EIAR?
Yes, I am, yes.
Thank you. If we then move on to 2 points which I'll try and take together, the only significant difference between you and Mr. Ferber in terms of significance of viewpoints are viewpoint 9, which we can turn to if we need to, but we were there yesterday, which is CD, for your note, CD 1.129, and the impact on a particular part of the slug road, which you described in your evidence at, I think, 6.4 little 4. My apologies, 6.5 little 4. You heard what Mr. Ferber said about those viewpoints yesterday. Do you maintain your position, and is there anything you'd like to add in respect to those 2 viewpoints?
I think for the benefit of the reporter, I'd like to say that, and I have said this in my evidence to the inquiry, I think there's very little between us in terms of the significance of landscape visual effects. I think the LVIA, and I say this from the benefit of having reviewed far too many LVIAs in my career, but I think the LVIA is generally sound and informative. Perhaps it lacks detail in some of the justifications, but I think they have come generally to the correct views, the correct opinions and judgments in terms of significant landscape and visual effects. So there are just 2 points, which I think is quite unusual generally at a PLI situation. Viewpoint 9, Drum Oak. First of all, I would say that I was a little bit surprised when I first looked at this viewpoint as to why it had been selected as a representative viewpoint, because there are much more open views and sustained views in the surrounding area from minor roads, in that network of minor roads that are quite concentrated to the southeast of the Hill of Fare. But notwithstanding that, obviously I was not involved at the scoping stage, so I did not advise on viewpoints. But I do understand that the applicants, landscape consultants, did consult the council and get agreement on viewpoints. The other point about viewpoint 9, well, it's more of a general point actually, and that's about moderate effects. So in the LVIA, it's judged that there would be a medium sensitivity and a medium magnitude of change, which equals a moderate and not significant effect. But I would refer the reporter to technical appendix 6.1, which outlines the LVIA methodology. That's reference 1.170. We don't need to go there, but just for interest. Moderate effects can be significant according to paragraph 1.11.5. So they can be either significant or not significant. And I took that to mean it was dependent on the judgment of the assessor. In terms of the LVI assessment for this viewpoint, which is, am I going too fast, or is that okay? So,
Only very, very slightly.
okay,
More
right,
interesting.
I'll slow down a bit. In terms of the LVI assessment, which is outlined in Technical Appendix 6.5, that's CD 1.174. I don't agree that the turbines would not diminish the scale of the hill group in this view. This is one of the many open views of the Hill of Fare from the network of minor roads to the southeast. In this view, the standalone nature of the Hill of Fare is appreciated. It stands out in terms of, the flatter land surrounding it. And to my mind, this increases the magnitude of change that would occur, such that I consider it would be medium to high, and I therefore conclude that the effects would be significant.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say about the slug road?
Sorry, yes, the slug road is a very well-used road, and actually, whenever I'm on it, there are many, many cyclists. I do feel that Mr. Ferber's assessment of effects from the slug road near Durras, it seems to put the vehicle driver as the principal receptor and not vehicle passengers or cyclists who will be freer to take in views. It is a suddenly revealed view of the Hill of Fare as you round the corner past the forest, Durras Forest. And as the road descends to the Dee Valley. So it's your first introduction really to the Dee Valley and the wider landscape. And I think that's why it's important. And that, to me, elevates the importance of that first revealed view. I consider that it would have a medium to high magnitude of change. And I would refer the reporter to my own landscape and visual assessment methodology, which is at the back of my inquiry report, and particularly Table 4, which defines categories of magnitude.
Thank you. If we can move on to Mr. Ferber's report in his section 6, where he deals with from 6.4 to 6.12 various viewpoints that Hofwig had put forward, and I asked them about this, as you recall, towards the end of cross-examination yesterday. I think just to lead for the moment to narrow the differences, as I suggested yesterday, you're happy with his consideration on Cairn Mount, which is 6.4, Scolty Hill, which is 6.5, the viewpoint 5, which is 6.8, and Miller Tap, and indeed viewpoint 8, and the road above Doris viewpoint 9. The two I want to ask you about are viewpoints 3 and 6, where there's a dispute, to some extent akin to that which you've just been describing from viewpoint 9, I think. What's your opinion as to the significance or otherwise of impact from those viewpoints, and Mr. Ferber's explanation of his stance?
In terms of viewpoint 3, I do agree with Mr. Ferber that it's quite a fleeting view at that point. You're at a high point in the road and you suddenly see the Hill of Fare and you'll see the wind farm on it. That's not uncommon where you've got a more rolling landscape in that area. So the views are less sustained. But I would say that in the vicinity of that viewpoint, there are residential buildings dispersed across that area, and more sustained views may occur on higher sensitivity receptors. So although I think in terms of the viewpoint on the road and in relation to people that are in vehicles, travelling in vehicles on that road, I do not think it would be significant. I think there are issues. It is a representative viewpoint of that vicinity, and I think there could be significant effects, particularly for cyclists potentially, and people that are residents. In terms of viewpoint 6, near the Loch of Skene, I've undertaken my own assessment of this on the basis of a representative viewpoint, rather than judging effects on a stretch of road which takes account of visibility and the degree of intrusion that would occur along the whole length of the route. I can't quite remember in terms of the A944, I think it is, what the length is, but I think it's something like 13, 14 kilometres or thereabouts that is considered in the LVIA. I found views west of the Gairloch Junction, which is just to the north of the Loch of Skene, to be fairly open for approximately a half a kilometre along that route, and with only a very few small trees filtering those views. The Hill of Fare is a prominent feature in those views, and I'm assuming the reporter, you have been to that viewpoint. And I think, in my view, the magnitude of change is increased there because of that combination of seeing the Loch of Skene with the Hill of Fare backdropping it. And I think that increases prominence. It increases the scenic composition that's experienced from that route. It is an eye-catcher on that section of the route. And I think also that I did observe that there are a number of residential properties which are very close to the road, maybe 2 or 3, that could potentially also have similar views. I think that would, in my opinion, increase the sensitivity of receptors from the low to medium judged in the LVIA for that A road. So I do consider that effects from that part of the road would be significant because of all those factors that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Now, coming to the last chapter of examination in chief, in your report at 5.8, you conclude that the landform of the hills would not remain the single most important defining characteristics, with the wind farm becoming an equally key characteristic. And you set that in paragraph 5.8. Mr. Ferber's disagreed with that. I think by reference to 3 visualizations, you'd like to use those visualizations to explain your position to the reporter and to respond as appropriate to Mr. Ferber's comments.
I think, Ma'am, if we could go to viewpoint 10 from the LVIA, that's the view from Meikle Tap. Do you need the reference? No.
I need the reference if you want the updated one with the tracks and BESS.
Yes, I don't actually have a copy of the updated visualization.
I've got the original one.
I think the original's fine.
The updated for your note is 2.9 or 002.009.
This view is from Meikle Tap. It's the high point on a promoted walk. It's listed in Walk Highlands website. From this view, you see much of the upland plateau part of the Hill of Fare. You don't readily see the steep and largely wooded forested side slopes. You can appreciate the narrow extent of the hills from this viewpoint. You can see virtually all of it at the top of the hill. While it may be correct, as Mr. Ferber said yesterday in his evidence, that the proposal would occupy roughly a third of the Hill of Fare, I think this doesn't take into account the high visual influence of the turbines and associated infrastructure on the character and scale and extent, horizontal extent of that hill group. I did mention earlier about the width dimensions of the hill group, and I said that from base of slope, the roads on to the north and the south, it was 7 kilometres. But the upland area, as perceived from this viewpoint and other elevated viewpoints within the hills, it is really about 3 to 4 kilometres, so it's much narrower because you don't see the side slopes. So in that respect, when you're in that landscape, this proposal would have a dominant effect on the horizontal extent of that hill group, which is relatively limited in my opinion. Then go to another viewpoint. There are only 3 of these, so it's not too bad to get through. But viewpoint 2, this is just one example which demonstrates the effects on the vertical scale of the hills. Similar scale effects are also illustrated by viewpoints 4, 5, 7 and 17, amongst others. I think I'd mentioned earlier that it's my view that the limited extent of the hill of Fare inhibits scope to set the turbines well into the core of an upland area and thus avoid a dominant effect on landscape scale, both on the hill of Fare and on the surrounding lowlands. I consider that in this view, the turbines would dominate the vertical scale of the hills. If you had something that was 30 metres, say, on those hills, that just shows relative to size how the turbines would affect that relationship between the structures that are on them and the relief of the hills. I think Mr. Ferber, in his evidence yesterday, mentioned that the turbines, he considered that turbines would be slender, I think the word was slender, objects that would minimise effects on scale and on the character of the hills. I disagree with that. They're solid structures, they're big structures. In my view, they would dominate the vertical scale of these hills as well as their horizontal extent. The last viewpoint I would like to go to is viewpoint 11. I selected this viewpoint because it illustrates the scenic backdrop that the Hill of Fare provides to surrounding landscapes. The diversity of the land cover is important in terms of the contrast it provides, and that really is a factor which influences scenic quality in terms of its contrast and composition. In terms of this view, you can see that the hilltops covered with moorland, particularly attractive at this time of year. We have an intimate mix of coniferous productive forestry, but with quite a good, what I would call, interlock with broadleaf components which are quite attuned to the landform They're not jarring or overly jarring. It is productive forestry in parts, particularly on this northern face, but it blends very well and interlocks well with broadleaves and with the lower lying farmland, the intensive farmland. Particularly on the other side of the hill, on the north face, there is more evidence of regeneration of native pine and birch, and this really adds to the semi-natural character with the heather moorland on the tops of the hills. In this view too, you also see the small clustered buildings which are part of the character lying at the foot of the hills, and again they provide sort of scale features, scale references within the landscape. And I think in terms of the hill affair, while I have clearly acknowledged in my evidence that it lacks a distinctive peak such as Benahi or Tapa North, as some of the other outlying hills and ridges, landscape character type features, it is nonetheless a key feature of this part of mid-Aberdeenshire because of its isolation set within settled farmland, its prominence, but also because of its scenic diversity in respect of land cover and also land form, but less dramatic land form than in some places.
Thank you. Are there any other visualizations which, akin with the previous one, you would ask the reporter to bear in mind from the same viewpoint, or from giving the same perspective, so to speak?
Yes, in terms of looking at the topic of diversity of land cover, I would say viewpoint 14, 17, 18, 7, 5 and 4. They're quite good illustrations of that diversity.
Thank you very much. I think those are all my questions for you. Unless you think I've omitted anything, I shall pass it over to Mr. Trinick.
Okay, I'll take another very short break then, and then we'll come back and continue till lunchtime. So I'll just break for...
Refer to, and you've got that list. Cross-examination wouldn't be complete without at least one question on methodology, so we'll get it out of the way. If you go to paragraph 1.5 of your inquiry report, you say very fairly you consider there is little between the applicant's landscape consultant and myself in terms of the judgments made on the significant landscape and visual effects. You've confirmed that this morning, likely to be associated with the proposed development. Where I provide more detail on the effects, I based my assessment on the methodology contained in Annex B to the report. If we go to Annex B, I've only got one question, Annex B, and that is, you say in the second paragraph, the LVIA undertaken of the proposal. You mean there the EIAR?
Yes, I do.
That's fine, that's okay. In terms of where you actually use your methodology, I don't think it's very much. If you look at page 16 of your report, paragraph 654, deal with the Slug Road viewpoint, which has been discussed quite a lot already. But I don't think you really use your methodology in terms of defining your version of, your view rather, of sensitivity or magnitude in relation to the Slug Road, do you?
No, I don't specifically note it there. I did work it out,
Sure.
but it's not in the inquiry report. I've used the criteria that I've outlined in that methodology, but I haven't gone into detail, that is true. What I haven't provided is a full LVIA. It is an inquiry report. It's providing evidence on what I consider to be the key landscape and visual effects of this scheme. And in terms of that, I have focused on the siting of this development, not on particularly on specific issues, especially given that I have acknowledged there is very little between us.
Yep. So I was putting my finger up to someone behind you, switched me off just then quite rightly, so I wasn't putting the finger up to you. To be fair to you, you do actually use your methodology, so I just draw attention to it to be fair, in section paragraph 5.3 and 5.4, where you do refer to differences of opinion on susceptibility, value and sensitivity, and therefore you do use your methodology. But the reporter can note that those are the two paragraphs where you explicitly set down your views using your methodology. Turn to the landscape sensitivity study now, if we may. If you get our document 8.3, sorry, 8.6 I think we need. Eight-six. Now you introduce the LSS in paragraph 3.1 of your report on page 4. I just use that as a reference point. The 2023 LSS, I think it should be there, replaces a 2014 Strategic Landscape Capacity Assessment for Wind Energy, which was carried out by Ironside Farrer. I think, were you the author of the new landscape sensitivity study?
No, I wasn't.
No. If you go, therefore, let's explore it so as to give the reporter some points of reference. We go to, I'll use the internal page numbering. Which is best for you, internal or electronic? Internal page 4. It's electronic page 5. You just add one in each case for this document. I'm just rehearsing some points here that very fairly that page sets out limitations on the assessment, which people can read for themselves, but noting in particular that it's a starting point. That's very fair. It's not to be read as a definitive statement on acceptability, point 3. Point 4, it's broad strategic and comparative basis. People can read for themselves. It's a very obvious statement. If you go to page 7, the executive summary tells us in the second paragraph from about the 5th line that sensitivity, each of the 24 LCTs was assessed for its relative sensitivity to specified wind turbine development by reference to a range of sizes. Just a question there which I put to Mr. Ferber in re-examination, that when you read for each LCT about the sensitivity to development, it means the sensitivity to development within that LCT. Is that correct?
That's correct, but I understand that well, there are references to development in adjoining landscape character types in some of the assessments, particularly under the criterion, the sensitivity assessment criterion of landscape context. which in the tabular, the detailed tables, sensitivity tables in the appendix, looks at what the effect would be of wind energy development in adjoining landscapes on the character of the principal landscape that's being considered.
That's very fair. That's exactly what it does. We're agreed. On bottom of page 7, the strategic appraisal establishes a benchmark for landscape sensitivity to wind energy development in Aberdeenshire in the interests of preventing erosion of the combination of elements and features that make one landscape distinct from another. So I'm only rehearsing, not asking a question there, although do intervene if you want to. Page 8.
Intervene.
Yeah.
You're going a bit fast for me. Where was that paragraph? It was.
Yes, of course. It's on internal page 7.
Okay.
The last paragraph I was just reading
Okay.
from.
Yes, I see that now. Thank you.
Thank you. And on page 8, the last paragraph on page 8, generally locations with most sensitivity to erosion of landscape character from the introduction of wind turbines are identified as those falling within LCTs identified as having importance to the identity of the Aberdeenshire landscape with high visual prominence, high relative remoteness and or recreational value. So it's a bit boring, but I want to get through it as quickly as possible. Go to page 25. The reporter can see there, can't she, the wind turbine typologies deployed in this LSS, a range from small, medium up to very large. And we can note that for the Hill of Fair proposed wind farm, we're a mixture of large, very large, at 125 to 200, and well, I'm not sure if we're on the cusp of the very large at 200 or not. It doesn't really make much difference, but that's where we are. If we go on to page 87, there, we've already been there, but for the reporter's reference only, is the assessment of the LCT within which the development sits. I'm not going to go through it because we've been through it. At electronic page 108, also internal page 107, there's a heading 531, Summary Findings, Landscape Sensitivity. And that takes us to certain maps which we'll go to, the Figure 4 series, so-called, in the second paragraph. And the final paragraph tells us that conclusions can be drawn from the sensitivity assessment overall as to where the opportunities and constraints to wind energy development associated with landscape impact broadly lie across the Aberdeenshire landscape, while the following outlines where there is most and least potential to accommodate turbines in terms of landscape sensitivity. These conclusions are indicative only of LVIA. If we come back now to your paragraph 4.7 in your report, which is on page 8, you are dealing there with the Nature Scott advice document 1010, which we've been to already this morning, and you refer to paragraph 41 of 341 of that document, and on the top of page 8, you say, I consider that the value of the focus provided by Hill of Fair would be significantly eroded by the proposed development, with the wind farm being excessively prominent when compared with other similarly sized developments located in less sensitive landscapes. And in 4.8, third line, second line, even if the layout of turbines on the site has a cohesive appearance with no obvious outliers or overlapping, if the site selected is inappropriate to start with, it's very difficult or more often impossible to mitigate the effects through design. That's perfectly fair. We know that modern proposals, 2025 proposals for wind turbines, from your knowledge, are now almost always more, not always, but almost always more than 150 metres to tip. We're looking at a range of somewhere between 180 and even 250 on occasions. That's the range we're looking at now. We're agreed?
Yes, I do agree, yeah.
Thank you. So if we go to document 8.8, which is the Landscape Sensitivity Assessment Planning Advice, Appendix 2 to the LSS, there are a series of maps, figures. We start off with one as the study area, which lo and behold is Aberdeenshire, and 2 landscape character types, a useful map, 3 designations and types, and then from 4.1, this is really where the LSS text ends up in terms of relative sensitivity, isn't it? And we can see for small medium turbines of 30 to 50 metres, well, there's a variety of levels of sensitivity across Aberdeenshire. It doesn't matter much to us. When we get up to 80 metres, the darker blue areas, i.e. those of lesser sensitivity, become fewer, and the paler areas start to increase. And then we come up to developments in figure 4.3, large turbines, that typology, 80 to 125, and the darker blue shrinks quite measurably, noting that, I think, let's look at area 28. Actually, area 28 is of high sensitivity even on figure 4.2 to 850 to 80 metre turbines. So from figure 4.2, this LCT is highly sensitive. Yes. And that obviously that's not going to get any better for us as we get bigger. So we go on to figure 4.3, we have what we have, and oh, how depressing. Figure 4.4, it's all, the whole of Aberdeenshire is highly sensitive. It's almost too depressing to look at table figure 4.5, but I will. No, it doesn't get any better. If we return, if you wouldn't mind, to document 8.6 and look at page 30, and at the bottom of page 30 there's a table 5 which explains the overall sensitivity ratings, and for high, most or all of the key landscape characteristics of the LCT, such as scale, landform, visual amenity qualities arising from designations, are highly sensitive to change from the development category. Severe and widespread adverse effects are likely to arise. Just to put that into context, we look at high and medium, which says that such areas may be able to be accommodated in very small parts of some assessment units. So not particularly optimistic, but a little bit better than high from our perspective. You see, that gives us a difficulty, doesn't it? That were we to propose a wind farm development with a modern turbine, actually even with one of 125 metres, doesn't really matter. But certainly the ones of the size proposed here, anywhere in Aberdeenshire, I suggest to you that it is vanishingly unlikely that we would receive a positive response.
I don't think it's fair to say that. I have been quite clear in my evidence that effectively the study is a starting point It's not a substitute for LVIA. It also clearly says that in the study itself. I wasn't responsible for the study, so I can't really comment on the findings, but I appreciate what you have said.
That's a very fair answer. Sorry. That's a very fair answer. However, it would be an even better answer if you could give you some examples of wind turbine developments involving tip heights of 150 metres or more, which have actually been granted a local permission or not objected to on a Section 36 application in Aberdeenshire. Can you give me any examples?
I can't. I've worked for Aberdeenshire for approximately 2 years, so I don't have that background. I understand there were objections to Clash and Direct 2, which were withheld at the inquiry in terms of landscape and visual effects, but then overturned. I am aware of the background concerning Glendy wind farm. I don't know the details of the other wind farms that have been recently consented, Fetteresso, etc. I'm not sure about that.
Mr. Briggs helps us with his evidence here. Mr. Briggs helps us with his evidence to some extent. Yes, as Glendy objected to, consent granted. Clash and Direct 2 objected to, consent granted. Fetteresso objected to, consent granted. I think we have to go back to Mid-Hill, and I'm not suggesting you know the answer, but it's fair to put the point, before we come across a locally granted consent in Aberdeenshire. You may not know the answer.
I don't know the answer.
That's fair enough. Although there may be, I'm not sure about Craig Neal, someone may tell me, but that's more recent. So when you say in your report at paragraph 3.4, might go there, that the purpose of the LSS is to steer applicants towards the most appropriate locations for siting onshore wind energy development in relation to landscape sensitivity. You won't be surprised to hear me suggest to you that its effect, if not its defined purpose, is to steer developers away from Aberdeenshire altogether.
Paragraph 3.4, that's taken from the document itself. It is described, describing the advice as such. I've just repeated that.
And we know from not well disciplined here at all. If we go to the LSS at even on the first page, right up front, that planning authorities are required, first paragraph, are to maximise their area's potential from wind energy sources. So this document, which is post NPF 4, explicitly acknowledges that LDPs must be positive in their approach to development. I think you'd agree with me, this document doesn't really achieve that purpose, does it?
Well, in terms of that, I don't think NPF 4 has any information on turbine sizes. It doesn't say that you have to maximise the area's potential in terms of accommodating very large wind turbines. So I guess in some respects the landscape sensitivity study, it looks at a range of wind turbine sizes and comes to conclusions on landscape sensitivity in relation to that.
Move that further away, I'll be able to see the light. That's a fair answer, but it cues in my next point, which we come to almost now. I turn to design briefly, just to make a headline point, I then return to it later. in your inquiry report at 4.9, the second half of that paragraph, fifth last line, while I consider the appearance of the turbines in relation to each other within the proposed development is broadly satisfactory, the confined extent and isolation of the Hill of Fare range inhibits the scope for intermediate screening, so it goes. So it seems to me that the key issue between us is not the layout of the development, it's not the design, it's the location. This is what we're at odds between us.
Absolutely, and I've made that very clear in my evidence.
I was going to stop in half an hour, so you carry on. Yeah.
If you go to your inquiry report at paragraph 4.9, again, same paragraph, but the first half this time, you tell us you've appraised many wind farm proposals comprising turbines of more than 150 metres. Not going to insult you by cross-examining you on that. I know you have. I consider the more successful schemes are those where the visual composition of turbines is simple, where substantial screening is provided of turbine bases by landform close to the site, thus reducing the perceived scale of very large turbines and close views. And then a passage which I found very interesting, the latter measure is particularly important given that onshore wind turbines are 150 metres plus, with some 225 metre turbines now consented, do not fit with the scale of many of Scotland's landscapes, including many more expansive upland landscapes. I want to just explore that. We've already agreed that turbine sizes, say in the last 8 years, have increased markedly from whatever they were then, 140, 150, maybe even less, up to, well, I think Nature Scots design guidance referred to 140, so let's take that as that was 8 years ago, take that as a peg. We're now up to the size we're at. The phrase you used there about not fitting with the scale of many of Scotland's landscapes, including many more expansive upland landscapes, mean than Hill of Fare, obviously. Let's see where that goes, that approach, in landscape terms, not policy terms, but in landscape terms. If you go to 4.11 on page 8 of your report, you say again, you make it very clear, I consider that the character and focus provided by the Hill of Fare and the widespread and severe effects of proposed development on surrounding well-settled lowland areas makes this an inappropriate site. And we have what the LSS has said already. Ignoring for a moment what you say about this being an inappropriate location, we can note, can't we, no national designations are in play between us, correct? You don't take an integrity point on the Dee Valley SLA? Correct. Obviously, there are no wildland issues involved here. And so far as you know, and I don't expect you to know necessarily, there are no unresolved consultee objections other than those relating to cultural heritage, the HES objection, and to landscape and visual issues.
That's as I understand it.
Yeah. And quite unusually for a 2025 wind turbine inquiry, there are no cumulative issues in play.
That's correct.
Yeah. If we go to document 1010, which is the siting and design guidance, which is horribly familiar, but let's all go to it. There's a paragraph you wanted to find when you were in chief and couldn't remember it, so I think we can find it. It's on internal page 8, paragraph 214. that's the one that indicates the size of turbines being considered in the report. Was that the one you meant?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's where we get the 140 metres. And I'm going to note, in fairness, it does say, though larger turbines are available. So it's not saying that's the highest you can get. Let's go to paragraph 323 of this document, which is on internal page 18. Just recording that landform is a key landscape characteristic, whether it is rugged, flat, undulating, rolling, upland, lowland, and says something about flat landscapes. Go to 331 and 32, which is really where my interest in asking you questions starts. Landscape scale and openness are particularly important characteristics in relation to wind turbines because large wind turbines can easily seem to dominate the landscape. For this reason, landscape scale can dictate the ability of an area to accommodate wind farm development, both horizontally and vertically. And in 332, a paragraph put by Mr. Finlay to Mr. Ferber, the key design objective will be finding an appropriate scale for the wind farm in keeping with that of the landscape. Should be of minor vertical scale. We're getting onto a key point in this inquiry in relation to other key features of the landscape. And it also says minor horizontal scale, which is not my focus at the moment. And thirdly, of minor size compared with other key features and foci in the landscape, etc. If developers are to be still expected in 2025 to not adhere to the guidance instead of obeying a rule, but to respect the principles of this guidance and try to accommodate wind farms to this guidance, then I can well understand what you say in 4.9, a bit about fit with many of Scotland's landscapes. Because I suggest that for a 200-metre turbine, it's going to be very hard indeed to envisage many, if any, landforms where such machines would be of minor scale in relation to other key features of the landscape.
I'm not sure I agree with that, and I have been quite careful to say many of Scotland's landscapes, not all of Scotland's landscapes, where you have a very simple landscape with few scale references, i.e. a few buildings, a few individual trees, small groups of woodland, field pattern, boundaries, etc. A simple open landscape, it's easier to accommodate a larger wind turbine. I think the thing is also that there is a balance to be achieved between minimising landscape and visual effects. We're all clear now that significant landscape and visual effects will be associated with commercial wind farm developments. And part of that will be, a factor in that will be that some of those developments don't fit with the scale of a particular landscape. But it's about minimising those effects. That's what siting and design is about in terms of, in my opinion. And this guidance provides good principles to achieve that. And I think the guidance that's given on looking at landform, looking at scale, looking at trying to avoid focal skylines, narrow ridges. So it's really about trying to select sites which are more expansive in scale, and that is the key issue that I have with this proposal. It doesn't do that.
I understand your issue with this proposal. clearly your evidence is very clear and very fair. You make your point. But if you look at, we'll leave that as a disagreement, and I'll come back to it later. If you go to paragraph 325 of Siting and Design on page 18, and perhaps just read it to yourself, this comes right to the heart of the matter here about a wind farm overwhelming the distinctive character and scale of the landform, especially prominent landforms. It's really the same point that I suggest that although the principles of this guidance are good, they're a good aiming point. I've noted that you've said that the objective must be not to hit every point on the head, but to minimize the effects. I understand that. But I suggest that while turbines of the scale commonly proposed in 2017, 140 metres thereabouts, might be capable of avoiding the landscape consequences articulated in that paragraph, it's increasingly improbable for all landscapes in Scotland that could be the case for 200 metre plus turbines.
I think key in that paragraph, 3.28, is distinctive and prominent skylines. Not all skylines are prominent or distinctive. Oh, sorry. 325. Oh, right. Okay, it still says distinctive character and scale of a landform. I think that's key too. And it does mention prominence. And I think that is the key thing in respect of this proposal and the Hill Affair. So I think that the guidance is sound and it is good. It displays sound design principles, siting and design principles in that respect. I do agree with that.
Okay. I see where we're going to differ obviously throughout this, but completing the exercise, if we go to 326 to 328, where skylines are addressed, and you know the advice so well, I'm not going to try to read it out to you. I know it, you know it. It's pretty, again, same point, probably get the same answer, pretty difficult advice to adhere to, even with 125, 140 metre turbines. But it becomes more and more difficult as you move up towards 180, 200, 220. Even in, I suggest, much more expansive landscapes.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think in a more expansive landscape, it's easier to set back from a prominent ridgeline, for example, and you would have more scope in terms of avoiding a distinctive landform feature. I think you just don't have that in terms of the Hill Affair.
Well, let's assume that you are right, that Hill Affair is a narrow upland as envisaged in paragraph 329. In fact, the next paragraph, where the advice is narrow bands of uplands between settled smaller scale valleys should be avoided if a wind farm on the hills would dominate the landscape on each side. That advice. Let's assume you're right, that Hill Affair is a narrow upland in that sense. Let's assume that you are right, that the effects of the development will, I'm not saying we agree, I'm saying let's assume for the moment the effects will be as you describe. And let's assume the reporter attaches weight to what you say and attaches weight to the guidance here in coming to her recommendations. The phrase that occurs to me here, using Latin for the first and only time in this inquiry, is quo vadis. Where do we go from there? Where I suggest we go is a very uncomfortable place, because if the size of turbines now being proposed can only be accommodated acceptably in landscape terms, never mind the planning balance, in landscape terms, in a very few areas, which are parts of Highland, parts of the broad uplands of Murray, perhaps subject to dark sky parks and what have you, in parts of Dumfries and Galloway. Can't think of many more areas. What will happen, I suggest, is what is happening now, and the very visible public angst, is a concentration, a vast concentration of activity on a very few areas, leading to very acute cumulative issues. That's where this all leads us, I suggest. Question mark.
I would say not necessarily. Yes, I would say that the best sites have been taken. They are occupied. And I would put in that the Galloway moorlands, that sort of area, Whiteley, Kilgallia, those sort of sites where you've got quite uniform, simple moorland character, which is away from settled landscapes, more settled landscapes. You haven't got, you've got relatively indistinct features. I think it's correct to say that, you know, some of those landscapes, less sensitive landscapes, are now full. But that's not to say that there aren't others that I don't know of, and I can think of other wind farm applications that I'm currently advising local authorities on and have done in the past, where I am advising that although there would be significant landscape and visual effects, I am advising them that I think it would be acceptable in landscape and visual terms, and they are taking that advice. So it's gradations of significance. It's taking a measure on what can be lived with and what is really just not right, actually.
No, thanks for that answer. But those parts of, and you know Scotland, frankly, better than most in this room. You've done work in most parts. And you and I both know, because we all worked in all parts, that the most attractive areas have long since gone in landscape terms. They've been filled. There are now extensions to extensions to extensions, and so it goes on infinitely. There are acute cumulative issues arising, and yet, we have to find more. It's uncomfortable, but we have to find more. So I repeat, I'm not quite sure where ultimately your approach takes us in terms of site finding. Question mark again.
Well, it's not my role to find sites for wind farm developers. And as I say, within Aberdeenshire, I was not involved with the landscape sensitivity assessment. I think I would just reiterate what I've said before, that it's now at a level with the push for yet more onshore wind. It's now at a level that we have to consider the least worst locations. And I'm afraid that, in my view, Hill of Fair is not one of those locations.
Fair answer. We disagree, but thank you for the answer. Now, I'm not examining your policy, so before Mr. Finlay leaps to his feet and objects, I'm going to rehearse one bit of policy, but only to make a landscape point. You said that in MPF 4 there was no guidance on what happens with when larger turbines come forward, no advice on scale of development. You're quite right, there isn't. But there is advice within the onshore wind policy statement of 22. And I quote from paragraph 361, CD91, electronic page 19, if people really want to go there, but I'll read it out. Meeting our climate targets will require rapid transformation across all sectors of our economy and society. This means ensuring the right development happens in the right place. I hate that phrase, but that's what it says. meeting the ambition of a minimum capacity of 20 gigawatts of onshore wind in Scotland by 2030 will require taller and more efficient turbines. The last sentence is underlined in the original by the ministers. This will change the landscape. Perhaps an acknowledgement, I suggest, that taller turbines may indeed be difficult to fit into even the most expansive landscapes in Scotland.
I think that's correct. I think it's also a factor of a lot of the best sites or the better sites being occupied already. So what we're getting is a lot of applications on the fringes of those core upland areas, which increases intrusion because generally they lie closer to more settled landscapes. But you mentioned it, Mr. Trinick, right development in right place in paragraph 3.6.1. And, well, you did.
He also mentioned he hated it.
Well, I love it. So, yes, this, in my view, is not the right development in the right location.
And as I said before, and yet, planning authorities are advised to maximise the potential for renewable energy development, as it says in the landscape sensitivity study for Aberdeenshire, including the potential for wind energy developments and not all renewables, in the knowledge, presumably, that what you say in this inquiry may well be true about fit and scale and type of landscape. So although it's a very uncomfortable message, and I acknowledge it is, what you're trying to achieve here really is a counsel of perfection which cannot be achieved.
I don't consider that correct. I advise, as you know, a number of local authorities and national parks. I take a very considered view in terms of specific applications. I've looked at a large number of them, and particularly since MPF4, I think I have, local authorities have had to recalibrate their expectations and desires. I think that's fair to say. And I certainly do not, I make comparisons when I consider individual developments. I consider what I think is the least worst situation in terms of effects. And I'm afraid that Hill Affair just doesn't pass that. Indicative, the number of significant landscape and visual effects is indicative of its standalone, prominent, small extent of these hills set within a lowland landscape. It's not like any other wind farm that I've encountered, actually, any other wind farm proposal I've encountered. And it did take careful consideration, but I just felt it wasn't in the right place.
Obviously we disagree, but that's a fair answer, and I'll take that answer. And ma'am, that's a convenient moment, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll break for lunch and we'll come back at 2. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Anderson, good afternoon. We'll now move into a more detailed discussion of the landscape, but it'll be very brief because we know where we're apart. The first point takes us to your precognition at paragraph 3.4 on page 3. And when you get to 3.4, if you just read it, people could just read that paragraph through, rather than me read it out. Thanks. It's not so much cross-examination as clarification here. But I wasn't quite sure what point you were making. But if we go to the statement of agreed matters, I'm not sure if you've got that easily to hand, and I can't even give you a document. What's the document number? Statement of agreed matters on landscape issues. I'll read that out. It's easier. The parties agree that the following published documents describe the baseline landscape character and sensitivity within the study area. You've got the SNH 2019 assessment, the Aberdeenshire Landscape Sensitivity Assessment 23, and the Strategic Landscape Capacity Assessment 2014. And then it says this document forms the basis for the LCTs identified in the EIAR, but is now superseded by the Landscape Sensitivity Assessment 2023, which is based on the SNH Character Assessment of 2019. It's agreed between the parties there are no material changes to the geographical extent and key characteristics of the LCTs between the documents that would materially affect the LVIA conclusions. As far as I know, the LCA of 2019, it's a fairly brief description of character. We know what it says. It doesn't contain anything, it doesn't break it down to a regional level, or it doesn't break it down beyond the level it is at. Whereas the 2014 document did descend into more detail of subtypes, or the units of the LCT.
Yes.
So when you say what you say in 3.4, I'm not sure if you're being critical of Mr. Ferber or not.
I am, because I got the impression that from his inquiry report, he was pulling back slightly from the conclusions reached in the LVIA, which did fairly acknowledge that there would be significant effects on a number of landscape character types. And I feel that his analysis in his inquiry report was just based on the key characteristics of the outlying hills and ridges LCT. It didn't look at, for example, the perceptual qualities of that landscape. It just focused on those key characteristics. It's a very general statement across all units of that landscape character type, and each unit has quite a distinctly different character.
No, I understand what you're saying, but the inquiry report, as Mr. Ferber has said before, is a bit of a summary of what has been before. I can say, I will recall, he does not depart from the conclusions in the EIAR. If we go to, therefore, CD 112, which is the relevant chapter of the EIAR, the LVIA, and go to internal page 10, we can see at 6524, the paragraph that this starts a discussion about the landscape character types and units of that type which are discussed, and that discussion goes on to 6531. And if we then go to 6641 on internal page 22, uh, 41 on page 22, I think this is what you're referring to, that we have a detailed analysis and conclusions on significance relating to the units of the LCT. Yes. And your point was that in his report, Mr. Ferber seemed to pull back from that more detailed analysis.
What I'm meaning is that the LVIA very clearly said that there would be a major significant effect on that unit of what was called the Grampian outliers at that time, but is the same as the outlying hills and ridges. What he did in his inquiry report, which he considered it to be informative, he then provided some detail, though it was quite selective, putting more negative aspects of landscape character into the mix. Although he has acknowledged in his evidence, I fully admit to that, he has acknowledged that it would be a significant adverse effect on that landscape. He hasn't deviated from that. But what I'm meaning is that the detail in those points against the key characteristics seem to be justifying the selection of that site for the proposed development in terms of thinking about land cover, presence of forestry, presence of existing wind farm developments that influence that character, which I do not agree with.
Mr. Ferber would say that all he's doing in 3.9 of his report, where he goes through the key characteristics, is to demonstrate how, in his view, the development responds to those key characteristics. It does no more than that.
I feel it has a particular spin to it.
I want to take you to a few viewpoints. They're the ones that you referenced in paragraph 513 of your inquiry report. I'm not going to try and persuade you that about the vertical scale of the hills and the scale of the turbines and the debates we've had already in the inquiry, because the reporter knows where we stand on that and we're never going to agree, so it would be rather pointless. But I do want to take you to a few viewpoints to explore purely as a matter of fact, not what flows from that, but a matter of fact, the issue of setting back the turbines into whatever the landform is, narrow or wide, and how successful that has been purely in terms of pushing the bases back from the skyline. So if we go to viewpoint 2, first of all, and looking at the wireline, please, but also you've got the baseline photograph above, and you've got your own site visit and assessment to inform what you would see. My suggestion is that the views of the bases of the turbines would, from that viewpoint, and I acknowledge, sorry, I'll wait till you get out the... Okay, yeah. The bases of the turbines, all of the turbines, would from that viewpoint, I acknowledge that a viewpoint is representative of a wider area, from that viewpoint be obscured either by topography or by the forestry.
I think I'm quite clear in my evidence stating that I wouldn't expect a substantial amount of the turbine uprights, the turbine towers, to be screened in any given development from key viewpoints in terms of setting back. But I would say that it does depend on the degree of screening. So, for example, turbine 1 is substantially unscreened. Very little of the base is screened. I accept from this viewpoint that turbines 16, 15, 14, 8, etc. are largely screened, but that's an aspect of that particular view because it's seen obliquely. From other views, those turbines are much more evident.
Other viewpoints
Other viewpoints.
not other
Well, as
areas
you mo-
close
as
to
you-
this viewpoint.
Well, as you move round,
As you move
will
round.
see much more. It's the nature of the screening by the hill in the foreground that is screening from that particular angle. But that does not occur universally in near 360 views around the Hill of Fare.
I'm going to go to other viewpoints, don't worry. If we go to viewpoint 4, so this is a view from the south of the Hill of Fare, and so moving around the compass, again all the turbine bases are set back from the skyline, aren't they? Pure as a matter of fact. I don't want to go into what flows from that, but that is the case.
I wouldn't say they're set back from the skyline. The skyline's a different thing. They are set back from the edge, from the edges.
Yeah, fine.
And there is a degree of screening, but those foreground turbines, 6, 7, 9, 10, I think it is, they are going to appear very large in relation to the relief of the hill as it's appreciated from that viewpoint.
Yeah, we're not going to agree about domination, vertical scale, but what I'm exploring very explicitly, I suppose it's to do with the depth of the landform to an extent, is when you move around the compass, do the turbines come down towards you so that you see the bases, or has there been some success in pushing them back so that at least the bases are hidden when you look from a particular viewpoint? That's what I'm after.
I have acknowledged in my evidence that there has been some slight improvement in terms of the amendments that were made during the design process, in terms of pulling back and omitting, I think it was 1 or 2 of the turbines from the early stages. But I would contend that in comparison with other wind farms that I have recently reviewed of a similar size and number of turbines, because of the nature of the Hill of Fare, it is difficult to actually get an adequate degree of screening of turbines. This particular view is taken quite close to the hill. When you stand back further away, 1 or 2 kilometres from that, you will see all of the turbines and very little screening of turbines.
Well, let's take that step back, again from the south, or rather a bit more southeast, south-southeast, to viewpoint 8. So we're now at 6 kilometres from the hill, so beyond the immediate shadowing effect of the hill itself. And I think whatever the success of it, we can acknowledge that I think maybe apart from turbine 12, possibly, you would not see the bases of any of the turbines from this viewpoint.
Oh, sorry, I don't agree, Mr. Trinick. We did say viewpoint 8, didn't we?
Yep.
Yes. I think viewpoint, I can't tell if it's 9 or 6. That looks like it's substantially unscreened. It appears like it's coming down on the slope facing the view. I think you mentioned 12. Yes, I would agree that 12 is substantially unscreened. The others, minimal amounts of screening. I just don't agree that there has been much benefit gained in terms of screening. There just isn't the space to do it.
I will acknowledge your view on turbine 9. I missed that out. You're right. That's not screened. correct. 9 and 12. Otherwise, we say the bases are screened. I'd also say that obviously as you move away from the hill and you get that slightly shallower angle of view, if that was the right phrase, you're also gaining in distance. And that has an effect in terms of the diminishing magnitude.
I think in general terms it does, but I think in this instance it doesn't have such a strong influence in terms of reducing the magnitude of effect, largely because with distance you appreciate the Hill of Fare as an entity, as an isolated hill group, and its prominence is revealed much more in slightly more distant views, and I think that increases magnitude of change.
Okay, well, I'm not going to agree on the magnitude of the effect, and we do agree on significance, in fact, from all these viewpoints anyway.
Absolutely, and I've been very clear about that.
But I'm just looking at the setback from the, I call it skyline, from the edge of the hill as seen from the viewpoint. And if I go to viewpoint 11 now, that's taken from the northeast. So we're going around the compass with a distance of 4.2 kilometres or thereabouts. And I think we can certainly see the base of turbine 14, and we can see the base of turbine 1. But apart from that, I think there has been some, whether you call it success or not, in setting back the other turbine bases behind the ridge, edge, skyline, whatever you want to call it.
I would maybe draw the reporter's attention to the photo montage from that viewpoint as well. I think that gives a slightly more easier to understand image of where precisely the bases lie. All I can do is reiterate that in comparison with other wind farms of a similar size that I have recently reviewed, there is relatively little screening, which helps minimise the landscape and visual impacts of this development.
Sorry for the muttering here, we're trying to get to the right viewpoint, but I want to go around the compass. From the north viewpoint 19. So a distance of 4 3/4 kilometres. No bases visible, I think. Do go to the photo montage if you want, perfectly all right. But about 10 hubs visible. Broadly correct? Subject to the point you're going to make, which you've made about the other viewpoints.
Yes, I mean, yes, I would agree that the bases are a bit more screened in at that particular angle. But still, nonetheless, the turbines are close and they appear close to the edge and they appear very large.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. That concludes that trawl through the viewpoints. We're never going to agree on the points you make in evidence about vertical scale and domination, but all I wanted to do there was to look at how far any setback had been achieved, whether or not you call it a success. There was some confusion I want to clear up about the extent of significant landscape character effects. If you go to your precognition at paragraph 4 on page 5, you say what Mr. Bell says in his hearing statement, and this is not the judgment made in the LVIA, which records 7 kilometres in extent. I can't find any definitive statement in the LVIA as to the extent of significant visual effects. Mr. Bell notes up to 10 kilometres, while Mr. Ferber mentions up to 12. I just want to get some clarity for the reporter on where we are on this. If we go to the Statement of Agreed Matters again, at 5.9, it's document 1337, I've been told. Paragraph 5.9 of that document, and then 5.10. We can see that there is agreement that there will be significant indirect effects on parts of the named units of the landscape type in 5.10.1-4. And that, they've got 7 kilometres for the first 3, and then 10 kilometres for the mouth. And I asked the question because if you go back to paragraph 3.6 of your recognition, you say significant landscape character effects out to 7 kilometres. Are we agreed on the basis of the Statement of Agreed Matters?
Yes, we are. That's an error. It should include the effects on the summits and plateaus outlined in 5.10.4.
So the reporter can adopt what we say in 5.10 of the Statement of Agreed Matters as the agreed position. That's good, thank you. Nothing to examine you on about visual effects and viewpoints because, except for viewpoint 9, we're agreed. We've done viewpoint 9 to death. We know where you stand. We know where Mr. Ferber stands. On the Slug Road, the additional viewpoint, again, we know where you both stand. I'm not going to narrow any differences by cross-examination, so we'll leave it there. But I do want to go on to nighttime effects, if I may. If you go to paragraph 14 of the Statement of Agreed Matters, the parties agree that significant nighttime effects would occur at the named viewpoints. And paragraph 15 notes that the council would additionally consider significant nighttime effects would occur from viewpoints 4 and 8. Now, it's a preliminary point to put to you before I ask you about those viewpoints, and that may or may not need to go to the consultation response by Aberdeenshire Council, but it was my impression that the Council doesn't object to Hill of Fair on the basis of nighttime effects.
I'd have to refresh my memory on that, but I don't think it was specifically mentioned, no.
I can tell you it's not specifically mentioned.
Okay.
Sorry. I can tell you it's not specifically mentioned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no objection. I want to clarify that point.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay,
I don't
that's
know
fine.
enough about it.
We might take that up in the policy session just to get some clarification on that. If we did look at the report of handling, which we needn't go to, but I record that there's only one paragraph on nighttime effects in that report, 6327, which records the view, because a view it was, that visible aviation lighting would extend the duration of significant adverse effects on views from approximately 10 kilometres. So that's what the report of handling says. In your inquiry report, you deal with nighttime effects in section 7. But you say nothing about viewpoints 4 and 8, so that's where I want to go and see if we can help the reporter here. do you adopt as your evidence what is recorded in paragraph 515 of the Statement of Agreed Matters? That is to say that the Council additionally considers significant nighttime effects of viewpoints 4 and 8.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, for viewpoint 8, there's no nighttime visualisation, but probably we wouldn't rely on that anyway, given the quality of all nighttime visualisations. So let's simply ask you, on what basis did you conclude a significant effect during the night time from that viewpoint?
Sorry, are we on 4 or 8?
I'm not sure that the time this EIAR was done, we were sufficiently sophisticated to look at decreasing intensity of experience at negative elevations and calculating that and doing detailed ZTVs about how many candela at such a distance at such an elevation. So I haven't got that information in front of me. So I'd simply ask you, taking account of the whatever the elevational difference is between the viewpoint and the turbine lights on the hub at the top of the hill, on what basis you would conclude a significant effect at this viewpoint?
I considered the fact that all of the lights would be visible, that they would be visible within around 6 kilometres. I considered the ambient light levels in that area likely to be relatively low and not completely dark, because it is settled, but sort of dispersed settlement in that area. That was the principal basis.
I'll come back to both viewpoints together in a moment, having heard that answer. I'll come back to both viewpoints in a moment, having heard that answer. But go to viewpoint 4, and there I think we do have nighttime visualization, possibly. Yes, we do. But as usual, it's less than helpful, so I'll ignore it. So I should have recorded in relation to viewpoint 8, and I do so, not asking for an answer, that in CD 1.174, Appendix 5 to the EIAR, the applicant's conclusion for viewpoint 8 at night is moderate and not significant. But I've heard your reasons. On viewpoint 4, the applicant says, and again, same document, CD 1.174, on page 8, the effect is moderate and not significant. On what basis do you say at that, it is a distance, much closer view, 2.3 kilometres, what basis do you say that would be significant?
That's precisely that. It's closer, there are fewer lights visible, I think it's just 2, but you're closer. And also, again, it's the ambient light levels, very low in that area.
I've been corrected on one point by my witness, who gets a silver star, that in fact there is a ZTV turbine lighting intensity. I mislaid that. It's a document 001.053, so perhaps you go to it. I've seen it before, how it escaped attention, I don't know. We can see a viewpoint 4 on that ZTV, that for 200 candela, the perceived intensity would be below 17 candela. You see that? Do you still maintain that 17 candela perceived intensity, that the effect would be significant at that viewpoint?
Yes, I do. And that's from my experience of seeing lit turbines, wind turbines, in different contexts across Scotland.
Yes, one point I will put you there is that, one point I will put you there is that, and it bedevils us every time, that you don't know exactly what you're looking at in terms of the type of lighting, the manufacturer, the degree of downward shielding. There are a lot of variable factors when you look at lights, aren't there?
Do you mean operational lights?
Yes, I mean operational lights.
Future lights or future lighting?
No, I mean operational lights. You go to a wind farm.
That's absolutely correct, but I know these wind farms sufficiently well that I know what the specification is, and I have appeared at an inquiry where lighting has been the main topic of, or the main part of the appeal.
Help me here, in terms of the operational lighting that you have seen, can you name I'm just not testing you on that so much. I want to know which of the wind farms you've actually observed.
Yeah, and this is where I've reviewed so many wind farm developments, the names kind of escape me.
I mean operational wind farms.
Operational, yes.
Yeah.
One in Dumfries and Galloway, and it's near Langham. And sorry, I think I'm going to have to come back to the reporter on that.
That's
because
perfectly
I
all
cannot
right. I
remember
mean,
the names.
yeah.
I've seen in Hours of Darkness the wind turbines in Renfrewshire, but they have no shielding, or I think they're constantly 2,000 candela.
Yeah.
So that's fairly limited. I've seen the wind turbines of the Hill of Turk, Benaturk wind farm, which one of the phases of that development, the turbines were lit. That's on Kintyre Peninsula. I've seen that from Arran in the Hours of Darkness. That was 32 candela and was clearly visible from Arran about 12 kilometres away. So I have seen during Hours of Darkness quite a few operational wind turbines with lighting.
When you saw those operational turbines, you knew that Benaturk, phase 3, I think it is, was 32 candela. Do you know the details for the Renfrew turbines at 2,000 with no shielding, and the first one, wherever it was in Dumfries and Galloway, you'll come back to us on?
Yes. I want to say Cairnharrow, but it's not Cairnharrow.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't.
I don't want to
can't
get too much
remember.
in the weeds on this, and I am already to some extent, but my suggestion is that the reporter, if she feels the need to make a nighttime visit in order to evaluate the nighttime effects, has to be extremely cautious in knowing exactly what she will be looking at in terms of the intensity of the light at source, because it can be more or less than the declared intensity, and the negative elevation effect, the distance effect, and shielding. She needs to know that before making a site visit.
Yes, I would agree.
Good. And again, a further point for both viewpoints, 4 and 8, they are on roads.
Yes, they are.
And
As are most of the viewpoints.
sorry?
As are most of the viewpoints. Sorry, as are most of the viewpoints.
Yes, indeed. Well, it makes my point even better, that the people on those roads at night are likely to be drivers of cars which have lights themselves. And therefore, I'm sure you've dealt frequently with the concept of darkness adaptation.
Yes, I'm aware of that. But I also would say that those are representative viewpoints, as we're all fully aware. And what they don't take into account is views from dispersed settlement, people living in the area that are adjacent to the roads or near the roads, accessed by private tracks, who would get more sustained views of lit turbines in relative proximity.
Could we broadly agree that, though, for the reporter again, to be cautious that whether people are driving along the road at night and have their darkness, their sight during night hours compromised by the fact of lights shining from the car, or whether people are at home coming out from a lit room into the darkness, there will be a period of adaptation before they're likely to be able to see red lights at some distance.
Yes, to a degree, yes, that is true. And I think those concepts are outlined in Nature Scott's fairly recent aviation lighting assessment guidance, which I'm not quite sure of the reference number, ma'am, but I can find that.
I just have one question on visual effects, and that takes us to 6.5. I've left the nighttime stuff now. 653, where you say on page 16, 653, I agree with the LVIA. That
Sorry, Mr. Trinick, which document are we looking at?
Sorry,
now?
your report. My
Oh, right,
apologies.
okay.
653 on page 16. I agree with the LVIA that significant adverse effects on views would occur from parts of Banchory, principally affecting the more elevated northern, happy with that, but then you say, and southern parts of the town. Now, the southern part of Banchory is, on the whole, at a lower elevation, close to the D. So, from where might public views be obtained in the southern part of Banchory?
I'm meaning on the other side, the southern side of the D, where the ground rises, and you've got some development in that area on rising slopes.
Yeah, it's a fairly limited area of view from that side of the D.
Relatively in relation to Banchory, I would agree, yes.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much indeed. I understand this may be our last outing.
I've just got a few questions, so I'll just carry on if that's okay. You talked earlier on about having a least worst test, and I wondered whether you had any examples of a wind farm proposal that had passed your least worst test fairly recently that might have failed it a few years ago. And it's not so much what the specific example is, it's just whether that benchmarks whether you've moved your test on with the height of turbines and policy.
That's a really interesting question, and I can think of one that's fairly close by, and that would be the extension to Clashendarroch, not Clashendarroch 2, but the proposed extension, which is on the Moray side. It's near the Cabrach area of Moray, and in terms of that, it would have major significant adverse effects, but I did feel that they would be relatively confined to the Cabrach and Devon area, and also because of the effects of there already being the Darnell wind farm nearby, that I felt some of the qualities of the Carbrack area had been eroded by that development, and that it was perhaps less, that kind of moderated the impacts of this proposed extension to Clashendarrow. It comes down the hill a bit more than you would like, but it is a case where the significant adverse landscape and visual effects, I consider them to be more confined than in comparison with Hill of Fare. But certainly the size of the turbines, from memory, I think they were between 180 to 200 metres. They would have a pretty severe impact, particularly on views from, I think it's the A940 road, yeah. But accepting that it possibly was in the least worst place as far as the sensitivities of the landscapes in Moray apply.
Thank you very much. And another thing you said earlier was that Hill of Fare was not like any wind farm you've encountered. And I wondered if you could expand on that, what you meant.
Yes. What I meant by that is I've not come across a wind farm application that's been cited on such a small and isolated hill group which is set in settled lowlands like that before. I've come across wind farms that have been, in my view, inappropriately cited, but for different reasons. But I think in the case of Hill of Fare, I feel because of its limited extent and its prominence, its special character within mid-Aberdeenshire, it just stood out as being, particularly poorly cited, in my view.
Thank you. I was going to ask about aviation lights, but Mr. Trinick has covered it. But like him, I'd just like to get clarity on whether nighttime effects are part of the council's objection, because it doesn't say nighttime, but it doesn't say daytime either, I don't think, from memory. But that's probably for clarification.
I think I would need to look at it carefully, and it might be something for the policy session. But certainly in my appraisal, my landscape and visual appraisal of the proposal, I tend to view, you've got daytime effects, visual effects, and I tend to consider nighttime effects as an extension of that, particularly if they're significant effects, that they would extend into nighttime. So I suspect that the council, in adopting my appraisal of the wind farm, have just talked about significant adverse effects, which I believe that's the main thrust of the objection.
And does your microphone, does your view on nighttime effects and whether they sort of cross the line depend on whether the viewpoint you're considering is in a protected landscape or not, that continuation?
Sorry, yes, it would do, and certainly in a protected landscape, I think, depending on why the designation, for what qualities the designation has been designated, the landscape has been designated, it would be dependent on that. And if, for example, aspects of wildness were particularly key, then that would certainly influence my view.
Thank you. And my only other questions on the RVAA. So your report to Aberdeenshire Council is bundled in with the council's application consultation response, which is, I don't think you need to look at it, but it's at document 3.3. And you'd said at that time, I think you broadly were happy with the methodology, but you thought there may be a need for further field work at 3 properties. That was properties 13, 21 and 22. 21 and 22 are Mid and Upper Till and Hilt, which Mr Ferber's recently discovered are demolished. The other one was property 13, which is Burnhead. Now, I thought maybe the reason you'd suggested more fieldwork might be needed at 21 and 22 was that, certainly I found when I tried to go near those, I couldn't really get anywhere near them. I don't know if that was your reason. But for the other property, Burnhead, what was your reason for suggesting further fieldwork might be needed there?
When I did my initial review of the proposal, I focused on going onto the site, walking around the Hill of Fair area, and also focused on the principal sort of aspects of the landscape and visual assessment. So it focused on key viewpoints, looking at key viewpoints and what the effects would be on landscape character and views. There are a lot of properties to look at. What I tend to do is when I do reviews of wind farms is I would generally go out with a planner from the local authority, which I did in this instance to Hill of Fair. Sometimes the planners, individual planners, will go round and look at the properties, each of the properties, but often it involves contacting owners, and that takes some time. I have not undertaken a detailed review of the individual properties considered in the RVAA, and I've been quite clear about that in my evidence. I've been in the vicinity of, the general vicinity of those properties, and I've reviewed all the visualizations that have been done and looked at the numbers of turbines that have been seen, that would be seen, the extent of them. But I haven't done a detailed assessment inside and out of individual properties. And I think in terms of those 3 properties that you mentioned, I felt from looking at the RVAA that those were potentially close to the threshold where they, there may be, there would be significant effects, but they may be close to the threshold. And that was a suggestion that perhaps the council would maybe double up and go and have a look at those. I'm afraid to say that I don't know whether that was done or not.
But RVAA is not part of the council. Sorry? RVAA isn't part of the council objection, though.
I don't think it is, no.
So that's all my questions. I'll take a short break before Mr. Finlay re-examines, if that's all right.
I'm in everyone else's hands. I mean, I think re-examination will take 10 minutes at most, so it's a matter for you and more particularly the witness whether they'd wish to carry on at this stage or
Well, if it's 10 minutes, we'll maybe do that now,
right,
and then we might close,
right,
unless Mr. Campbell thinks he can canter through a witness very quickly. But otherwise, I'm happy to close and resume on Tuesday. No, that's might put you under a lot of pressure. Okay, you carry on, and then we'll close when you're finished.
I thought you want to carry on now. Sorry, my apologies. I misunderstood you. Right. Going back to this morning, you had an interesting discussion with Mr. Trinick about wind turbines generally in Aberdeenshire by reference to the 2023 study, which is CD 8.6, and you went to look at the maps, which are, I think, CD 8.8, and perhaps we could, first question, to what extent did that study or that general approach to wind turbines in Aberdeenshire influence your specific views on Hill of Fare?
I'd have to say it didn't influence my views. I formed an opinion based on the site visits that I undertook and informed by the visual information provided by the applicant.
Thank you. That places that cross-examination and perspective. You were taken, though, to see what Mr. Trinick described as the depressing pages in CD 8.8, I think it was. But and he was asking you about wind farm, consented wind farm development in Aberdeenshire. If you have that document open and turn to the last page, which is figure 5, does that give an indication of the consented wind turbines in Aberdeenshire as at 2020?
As at 2023, yes, it does. But things have moved on to some degree since then. For example, I think the Glendy consent has not been added or is not included on that map, which is understandable given the timing. I'm not sure if even Clash and Darroch 2 is on there as a consent. So yes, probably at 2023 that is an accurate picture.
Thank you. You then had a further interesting discussion about wind turbines in Scotland more generally, and the approach of potentially, if one applied siting and design in extreme. To what extent is that more general approach relevant, or to a landscape consultant seeking to assess effect or impact? To what extent is what might be called the policy background relevant to your assessment of impact or effect?
Policy has no influence, or should have no influence, on landscape and visual impact assessment.
Thank you. You were then, towards the end of cross-examination, asked, taken on a tour of visualizations looking at wind farm, whether or not you could see a wind farm base. Is there any guidance which suggests that not being able to see to the base of a wind farm is a particularly good thing or bad thing, or indeed something that is material?
Not specific guidance, but I think in the siting and design guidance from Nature Scott, I think there is guidance on setting back larger turbines which has a similar effect to providing, usually to providing some screening and some distance from sensitive receptors, which can minimise effects.
Absolutely. But again, just staying with the idea of a base, I think the towers will vary in size depending upon the height of the tip height. So for 200 metre turbines, the tower would be 122.5, I think, and 108. These are indicative heights because I don't think there's a specified turbine. And for 180 metre turbines, the turbine tower would be 102.5 metres high. Again, just the fact that you can't see the bottom 5 or 10 metres of a turbine, what difference is that going to make to landscape or visual impact?
I think I did make that clear, that it was about degrees of screening. Just screening a small proportion of that tower is not going to make any difference in terms of minimising effects.
Yes, those are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we will close today, which means we'll need to continue landscape and visual impact inquiry session on Tuesday, the 9th of September, and we'll conclude that day and move on from that into the policy and then the conditions hearing sessions. Between now and then, we'll have the community hearing session here on Monday evening at 6:30. So I'll see the community there and everybody else the next day, unless you're here too. Thank you very much for this week.
So, ma'am, just one question. Are you envisaging any accompanied site visits?
I'm just thinking about possibly one, but I haven't decided. And I will decide and let people know today.
When would you envisage doing that?
It would make sense to do it between the landscape and the policy session, but that's just on the hoof that I'm answering that.
That could squeeze the policy session and conditions might squeeze it quite a bit. Is there a possibility on Monday afternoon?
There is, but I might not have one. There's one I want to mull over. If there is, I'll think about Monday afternoon though, yeah.